My name is JM, and my friend's name is RS, and we were hiking about a mile above Sand Canyon in California. He lost his prescription sunglasses, and we split up to search for them. As I was hiking, I saw a very strange track. It looked human, but it was larger than any human footprint. Also, unless a human was walking a mile from the road barefoot through rough terrain, it couldn't have been a human. I met up with RS, and on the way back I showed him the print. He is an Army veteran from Iraq and an avid hunter, and he was simply shocked by the footprint. He said to me, "Jay, look, you can even see the toe prints. This creature has to be at least 7 feet tall." We looked at each other, and I asked him, "How old do you think that print is?" He answered, "It looks to be about 3 days old." We both decided after finding his sunglasses, we should head back to the car while keeping a very sharp lookout for anything strange. After we had reached home, it started to snow. We both realized it was very fortunate that we got to see that, because the snow would have wiped it out. I lived in the high desert of California in Ridgecrest in Kern County from 1980 to 1985. I did a lot of hiking in the Sierra Nevada mountains. I never saw or heard of anything unusual during that time. My mom, sister, and family, and brother, and his family still live there. My 19-year-old son and I were visiting various family members from September 17th to September 27th, 2007, in Ridgecrest, California. My sister took me and my son up to Seibert Family Gold Mine, cabin, and mining equipment on the 24th of September. We had spent about an hour at this location, and we were preparing to leave. My sister was in the porta potty, and my son and I heard this high-pitched scream, like a woman hollering. We yelled back, thinking it was a woman in trouble, but there was no reply. I asked my sister if she had heard it, and she said no. I told her what we had heard, and she told me that she had a horse backed and hiked through this area and had never heard anything that would make that kind of sound. She has lived in this area since 1980. I asked her husband, who's an avid hunter, horseback trail rider, and hiker in these mountains, and he said that he knew of no animal that made a high-pitched scream in this area. My brother-in-law also lived in Ridgecrest, California area all of his life. I was about 14 years old, riding a horse on a ranch that my family owned. The ranch location is somewhere in California. I won't disclose where. I was on a trail going towards the edge of the forest, still on our property. When I reached the edge of the forest, there was a dead cow. It had been dead for some time now, because it was mostly just bones. When I looked around, still on my horse, that's when I saw a Bigfoot. He was really tall, black, and so human-like. He looked at me, but was not scared. I said to myself, that's Bigfoot. Bigfoot had one hand and arm leaning up against a giant tree, and he looked to be both man and ape. Bigfoot looked right at me, and we both just looked at each other. I was so scared that I turned around and went back to the ranch. I've blocked this out of my mind for many years, I believe from being scared to death. I spoke to my dad about the ranch. I asked him, do we still own 10,000 acres in the ranch? He said no, and is now 90 years old. I asked him, did anybody ever say they saw Bigfoot? And he said yes. I could take you to the spot where I saw him, and I'm sure somebody who lives in that area would say they have seen him also. Why? Because he is there. He is out there, living. This happened 28 years ago, but I remember it very clear now for some reason, and how he looked at me. In late September 1989, I was deer hunting about 5 miles west of Walker's Pass along Highway 178. I had driven a short ways off the highway and then walked about a quarter of a mile to a rocky bluff that was at the base of a very large, steep mountain. I believe it was Pinyon Peak. While sitting there in the dark, I continually had the feeling that I was being watched. I have had this same feeling 2 other times, and in both situations, I spotted a mountain lion watching me from a distance. As gray light came, I started glassing the steep, dense mountain behind me and looking for whatever it was that was watching me. I really could not see very much as it was still fairly dark, and the brush was so thick. I cannot remember how long it was that I was glassing the area when a very loud, booming scream echoes from the mountain behind me, several hundred yards up. It sounded almost like a terrified woman screaming as loud as she could. At first, I thought that somebody was just playing a hoax on me. The more I looked at how steep the mountain was, the time of day, early morning because I only had gray light, and how dense it is up there, the more uneasy I became. I left the area immediately. I am a long-term seasonal with the U.S. Forest Service. I do know the different tracks the wildlife leaves behind. What I and a coworker saw was not a typical wildlife track. On this day, we decided to go to the Paiute Mountain to cover illegal OHV trails. As the day was going, we covered 5 illegal trails around the Landers Meadow area, then decided to head for the Weldon and Woolstaff Meadow area. As we were heading towards the Weldon Meadow area, a rancher stopped us to ask if we saw some of his cattle. Our reply was no. If we see them though, we'll let you know. We never found them. At Weldon Meadow, we stopped for lunch, and this was our next area to work. During lunch, the coworker went to do a little exploring. After about 10 minutes, the coworker yelled to me to come see and ID some wildlife tracks. These were not wildlife tracks. We saw what looked like something like a human foot track, but it was way too big with a slight distortion in the toe. The tracks measured about 16 inches long and 7 inches wide. The tracks looked like the ones I saw last year at the Six Rivers National Forest. I snapped a picture of the track and looked to see where the tracks were going. The tracks followed the barbed wire fence. The meadow area is used for cattle grazing. The coworker asked me what it meant. I just said, it's possible that Bigfoot was looking for food or was heading for the spring at the end of the fence. We then proceeded to do our work so that we could finish this area and head for the other area. We finished and headed towards the Woolstaff Meadow area. Once down there, we proceeded to do our job. While working on the project, I spotted the same tracks that we saw earlier. The tracks cut across the trail and headed towards some rock outcroppings. This was enough to spook my coworker, and so we left the area. Back at the office, the coworker told me what we saw and was laughed at. I didn't tell them that I snapped pictures of the tracks. I too would have been laughed at. On a day after the snow had fallen, we went hunting up in the Lake Hughes area in California. There were 4 of us hunting that day, my dad and myself and 2 good buddies. Well, the deer hunting was not that good that day, so one of my buddies said to us, my wife's uncle is gone from his cabin and won't be back any time soon, so why don't we visit his land and all and just hang out and all have some lunch? Well, he lives by Lake Hughes Road and close to where we were. We went over there and unlocked the gate as he had a key. We went in there and we had brought some apples for our lunch and all. We had seen some hogs and started feeding them apples. After about an hour and a half of doing this, we heard the horses behind the house or cabin running around and making all kinds of noise. We could not see what was going on, as the house was in the way, but man, were they going nuts. So we all said to each other, let's get over there and see what's up. We did and could not see anything but the horses still going nuts and running in circles. We then looked over the fence and through a gate and seen these huge footprints and smelt something like a dog's that's been wet and rotten eggs mixed. Well, the gate was locked and he went inside the cabin or house and got a key for the gate. So we went over to the prints, and I'm 6'5" at this time and weigh 275 pounds. I have a shoe size of 15 4E. These tracks were much bigger than my shoe, and they were made with some of them in the snow. I stepped next to them and could not press down in going that deep. I could go maybe 3/4 to 1 inch down. These prints were 4 inches deep in the snow. They were also 2 to 3 inches longer than my foot and much wider. Then I tried to step that far with my step, and no way could I. Then we followed the tracks until they came to this really steep hill. There, this thing went up to this hill on 2 legs and stepped high enough that even my good buddy, who was a bodybuilder and in great shape, could not climb. I could not even lift my leg that far, and I was 16 years old and pretty limber. No man could lift their leg that high or step that far. No man. Nowhere did we see bear tracks, and even if we did, they don't walk that far on 2 legs. Whatever this was, it walked along this fence and turned and went back into the woods, and then up this very steep hill. It must have looked at the horses and maybe seen us feeding the hogs. I never seen it, but we got scared and left the ranch. I have told this story to a few people, and they look at me. It could be, but you can tell. They don't think it's real. But when you see things like this, you just know something is out there. Nobody can change my mind on this one. I know what I seen, and it is not set up. Nobody knew we were going to his ranch. And the next ranch over, nobody was home there either. So the only thing that could be is, this was real and not fake. Nowhere did we see any human footprints by any of these tracks or up that steep hill. I know something is going on up there. First, as a matter of background, I want to tell a little about myself. It will help explain the delay in ever having reposted this incident. The sighting occurred about 3 months prior to my entering the United States Army. I served for 3 years as a paratrooper with a top secret clearance. After my time in the service, I became a Los Angeles police officer. I did that for 13 years and am now a federal agent, working for the OIG out of Washington, D.C. With that background, you can probably understand my reluctance to discuss this sighting with too many people. It really boils down to a potential career killer. That being said, the incident did occur, and I remember it vividly. Many, many years after the event, I reconnected with my friend, who was the witness, and asked him to tell me the story as he recalled it. I wanted to check my memory and see if it matched mine. It did. To a T. Only a few months ago, I spoke with my brother-in-law, a witness after the fact. I asked him if he remembered the event. He did. It should be known that he is not the kind of person that would buy into such a story. He had not been semi-involved. Anyway, this is what happened. My friend Craig and I were both 17 years old and waiting to leave for Army basic training. He was due to leave in June, and I would go in August of 1980. We were staying with my sister and brother-in-law at the time. They lived in a cabin in Green Valley, California. Craig and I enjoyed our last months as civilians in that area, and used it to train for the difficult training ahead of us. We ran every day along the mountain roads and hiked the hills, trying to get into prime shape. In May, we decided to test ourselves and camp out for a full 7 days. We knew the perfect place for this would be what we called the old campground, because of its isolated surroundings and terrain that would be perfect for climbing and hiking. So, we packed up a week's worth of supplies, and though my sister Cindy and her husband Tom offered to drive us, we decided to act like soldiers and walk to the location. We did this with full packs. My sister and Tom advised us that they would check on us at least every other day, and that they would bring us food and lemonade and such. Tom also offered to provide us with 2 weapons to be used for protection against any strangers that might try to harm us. After all, this was before cell phones, and we would be on our own big time. There was also a heavy rattlesnake threat in that area, so we happily took him up on the offer. Tom met us at an area near the mine shafts later that day and gave us an M1 rifle and a 12-gauge shotgun, ammo for both as well. The dirt trail that leads off the main highway goes very far back into the mountains. In fact, where you traverse it to its end, you would end up on top of what is known as Grass Mountain. Craig and I decided to get about 3 miles in and away from the highway, which was about a mile past what was once an old 1920s campground, and live deep in the bush like soldiers would. We found a great spot, next to a clear running creek, and set up our tent in the clearing that was there. This clearing was completely surrounded by thick woods. Then, night fell. As we laid in our tents, talking by the light of flashlights, we both heard the very loud snap of deadfall in the woods behind the tent. We sat up, frozen and listening. We heard what sounded like a very large and heavy person, slowly walking around our site, making no effort to conceal his presence. Judging from the loud sound of breaking sticks and brush, we were both scared, believing that someone was out there. We exited the tent, Craig with a shotgun and me with the M1. I started yelling very loud, "Hey, we know you are there. We have guns and we'll shoot." Again, we heard the sound of somebody walking slowly, but methodically, around from our left to right. We shined our lights in the direction, but could not see anything but the trees and brush. We talked amongst ourselves, wondering if it could be a bear or something, but we decided that it was a person and not an animal. After much yelling and warning that we would shoot, I decided to fire a few rounds in the direction of the noise. How crazy that sounds now, and I did just that. I fired about 3 rounds into the trees, and the sound was unbelievable. The weapon blasted, and the sound echoed into the night, roaring into the canyons and fading off into the night air. We stood in silence. To our utter disbelief and eventual horror, whatever it was began to move again, still left to right, in a circle around us. What we both thought and discussed later was that no animal would have stuck around after the horrific noise of the M1. Most normal people would have not stuck around either. Whoever or whatever was out there not only stuck around, but appeared from the casual sound of the slow walking to be less than concerned about our weapons. We made a decision to vacate the area post-haste. Grabbing our coats, we climbed the embankment up the dirt road, carrying our weapons. We ran the entire way, about 3 miles more or less, back to the main highway. We spent a very long night, curled up in a concrete drainage ditch, waiting for the sun to rise. Every hour or so, a lone truck would come by, and the sound of that brought us comfort. Again, it was a long night. The next day, we hiked back to the site, expecting to find our tent and all of our supplies missing. To our surprise, everything was as we had left it. Nothing was out of place. We gathered our things and hiked back to the open area of the old campground. We decided to not sleep in the tent because it limited our vision, and instead laid our sleeping bags out in an open area above the creek. After a day of climbing cliffs and cooking and such, night fell again. That night, just as the sun set and darkness was beginning to fall, Craig and I were walking in the direction of the main road. We were looking for rattlesnakes because we had shot one earlier on the dirt road in the same area. As we walked side by side with me on the left, both holding weapons, we saw it. Standing just on the dirt road, facing us, was a Bigfoot. There can be no doubt at all about what it was. We could see it very clearly. He was about 8 or 9 feet tall and stood with his left shoulder even with the edge of the trail. He was covered with dark hair and had long arms. We did not smell anything unusual, as I have since read about other sightings. The strange thing about him was the absolute indifference in his expression. He did not look threatening. He did not look scared. He just stood there looking at us, almost bored. I instinctively brought my right hand up against Craig's chest, and we both stopped dead in our tracks. We never took our eyes off the Bigfoot as we spoke. I said, "Do you see that? Are we seeing this?" And Craig just said, "What do we do? What should we do?" We both started to walk backwards as we spoke, very slowly and involuntarily. The Bigfoot just looked at us for a few moments. Then, I will never forget the detail of this. He just slowly and very casually turned to his left and began to walk into the forest. When he did that, Craig and I stopped and started talking over each other. Do we shoot it? Should we shoot it? What do we do? Do you want to follow it? As we talked, we heard a sound that we both immediately recognized from the prior night. The sound of the Bigfoot slowly walking deeper into the woods, breaking deadfall, twigs and branches as he went. We never did fire a shot or follow him. We stayed up late and slept in shifts at the campground and did not hear from the Bigfoot again. The next day, Tom came up with food and supplies. We ran to him and told him the details of what had happened. It was very clear by his expression that he did not believe us. We took him to the exact spot where we saw the Bigfoot, and we discovered a trail of giant footprints leading from the trail into the woods. Tom smiled and told us that we did a good job making them. We were so frustrated and begged Tom to follow the tracks with us. We all followed them, and they went into and across the creek. On the other side, we found a large red anthill with a footprint right on top of it. I asked Tom, how could we have done that? He just shook his head and smiled. We followed the tracks to a point where two large hills formed a valley that sloped upwards into the mountain. The ground turned rocky, and the prints stopped. That is what happened. I have lived with this memory for many years. I am now 45 years old and am less concerned about what people think of me in terms of this incident. It is a fact, and because of it, I know for sure that Bigfoot lives, or at least once lived, in the area of Green Valley, California. Me and a friend at the time were hiking in the Angeles National Forest. My friend was just out of boot camp, U.S.A, and we started hiking as often as time would allow. We were hiking down a small stream bed that went downhill. The stream was all dried up, and it was mostly rock hopping until we got to the bottom of the hill. At one point, there is a small section off to the side that is just dirt and makes for a much easier walk down to the bottom. When we got to the bottom, we hiked a bit more, but as the sun started to go down, we headed back up the same hill, creek bed. I followed my own boot tracks back up as I was tired of rock hopping. While going up, the smell in the air was horrible, like rotten eggs or portable toilet. I then noticed on one of my tracks laid a dead ground squirrel right over my boot track. I pointed this out to my friend, and as soon as I did this, a loud banging over a short hillside was heard. It was coming from about 35 to 50 yards away from us. It sounded as if a large log being hit against a tree. I looked at where the noise was coming from and noticed the tops of the trees were swaying back and forth. All this time of the swaying of the trees, the pounding on them could be heard. Then the pounding stopped, and a loud groan and scream were heard from the same area as the pounding of the trees. I have never heard anything like it. I've heard mountain lion, black bear. This was nothing like that, and it was very, very loud, to the point it was damn scary. My friend asked if we should look over the small hillside to see what was making the noise. I told him no way, and he agreed. When we started walking away, the banging and screaming would stop, but as soon as we stopped, it would proceed with the groan and screaming, and the trees would start swaying again. We finally got out of there, and my friend did not want to talk about what happened. About 15 years ago, I was 17, 18. I went on a hike with a friend, trying to reach Smith Mountain, on the edge of San Gabriel Wilderness. We made it to the saddle where the trail goes downhill into the wilderness, and where we were supposed to leave the trail and go south up the mountain, and decided we didn't feel like going any further. I'm assuming we rested for a while, and I remember just talking and hanging out. As we were getting up and ready to go, we heard a strange noise coming from the bushes nearby. We stopped talking and listened, and it was a very loud, very low sort of growl, snuffling sound. My first thought was that it was probably a bear, but that ultimately I had no idea what it was, and it sounded like it was growling at us. The bushes along the trail were so very high, such so that we couldn't even see through them. It scared the hell out of us, and we quickly hoofed it back down the trail. I'm not sure if we ever spoke about it again, except to maybe say I wonder what it was, that was scary, etc. But afterwards, I actually looked through the field guides, trying to figure out what was making the noise. I knew that bears, mountain lions, and bobcats are relatively prevalent in that part of San Gabriel Mountains, so I assumed it was probably one of those. But after looking around at other sightings near that area, I'm beginning to wonder. In retrospect, it sounded a bit ape-like, very low-pitched, so that we almost couldn't hear it at all, and had to ask each other, "Do you hear that?" Take it as you must. I just think it's an interesting in the context of the other sightings to the area. I only wish I could remember any more details and that we had the cojones to hang around longer and check it out further. My girlfriend, who later became my wife, and I were traveling on a rural road, Panama Road, that connects the outskirts of Bakersfield, California, to Lamont, California, just a small town 14 miles outside of Bakersfield. This area is surrounded by agricultural fields, mostly grape vineyards. I was traveling at approximately 55 miles an hour. That was pushing it for my 65 Mustang at the time. As we talked, we both saw something walking very fast, almost a slow jog across the roadway. I slowed down without slamming on the brakes so as to not lose control and try to figure out what we were seeing. We saw its right side and back as it ran into the field. The head to the shoulders was slouched, could not see a neck. It was approximately 6 feet tall, long arms and thick legs. It never looked at us as it crossed. It was extremely dark, almost shadowy but very much real. Appeared to be very hairy. As we passed it, it never looked back. I quickly stopped and began a U-turn, at which time my girlfriend yelled at me, asking what the hell I was doing. She knew what I was about to do. I drove back to the location to where it ran into the field, and I hit my bright lights. Did not see anything. My girlfriend was yelling at me to get going, so I did. I returned to the area the following day, but it had rained and I could not locate any footprints. It was too muddy. My wife will only discuss it if I bring it up. Aside from that, she never talks about it. To this day, I have no idea what we saw. I know that it was not human as we know it, yet I cannot say that it was a complete animal either. I still drive by there once in a while and wonder what it was that we saw that night.